A bit about the Water Hub before we get into today's content. We are like a nonprofit communication shop that works on behalf of the water movement. We do free trainings for anyone that works on water and climate on a whole range of topics, from working with imagery to working with influencers to messaging. We also offer a number of tools and resources on our website, including guides and worksheets for everything from campaign planning to op-eds. And we provide hands-on help with creative, with working with the media, design, and increasingly these days with video. And we are super excited to talk with you today about messaging because this has been a hot topic in our network. How do we adapt to this moment that we're in? And so I want to mention that we are going to be sharing polling today from the Water Hub's latest national voter poll, which was fielded in October, but we're also going to be referencing more recent research, and we'll drop some links into the chat, as well as include all of them in our follow-up email. So we're going to talk about what the data shows, and we're going to dig in particular into two of the topics that are the hottest and the trickiest to communicate around this year, both climate and equity. And as I said, we're going to talk about this gap that exists historically, but perhaps even more now, between what voters say is important to them and what they show up for on election day. And then also the gap between where the public is and what elected officials prioritize. And we're going to share some of our thoughts about how we can close that gap and make sure that elected officials at all levels of government understand how vital water is for community health, safety, et cetera, and how much of a concern it is for their constituents. We're also going to be excited to hear from you both about how you're navigating some of the complexity now around climate and equity, and also who you're most focused on reaching. And we are planning some research this summer in partnership with Climate Advocacy Lab around views on climate resilience. And so we'd love your input. We'll drop a survey at the end of the session for you to share a little bit more about what's top of mind for you that might be helpful for us to dig into in our research. With that, I will pass it to Sarah to kick us off with what we know from public opinion research.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So I want to start by grounding us in what we know, and then we'll dig into the gaps that we're seeing. And I'm sure people have seen this chart before. In fact, this session is building on a briefing that we did a few weeks ago with the Environmental Polling Consortium on voter views on water. And so I want to start again with this chart plotting the annual environmental poll that Gallup does every year. This is just a few of the data points. They ask about a whole host of other issues and other questions, but I find this particular slide really telling, which shows, if we go back over 20 years, that the pollution of drinking water in particular, and the pollution of rivers, lakes, and reservoirs tops voter concerns of environmental problems over other concerns like air pollution, climate change, and all the other things that they ask about. And I might be a little biased. I work at the Water Hub, but we really think that makes sense. Water is something we do have a really intimate relationship with. It's something that in many ways has historically been seen as a nonpartisan issue historically. And it's something that we have in our homes, in our bodies. We use it to make food for our families. There's a relationship that we have with water that's really powerful. And we feel like that gives us an opportunity to connect with people around a whole host of other issues. We also find in our polling, so Nicole mentioned, and Brianna I think can share in the Q&A, a link to our October 2024 poll. But in much of the research that we have done over the years, we find that issues around delivering safe drinking water and sanitation are some of the most unifying across political ideology and across different demographics. One of the major themes that we see in our polls is that issues framed around drinking water, whether it's how a problem threatens drinking water specifically, or how a solution protects it or cleans it, generates the most concern and the most support from voters. We also see other themes around strong support for rivers, keeping rivers and lakes clean, helping communities prepare for and recover from extreme weather, and support for nature-based projects, things that work with nature to benefit our communities. So projects like improving ecosystems to stop flooding, planting trees to clean water and keep our neighborhoods cooler while creating park access, are some examples. But, and this is where we want to hear from you first, if these are things voters really care about, why is there a gap between these voter values and the actions of our elected officials? There's myriad reasons why this is probably true, but I wanted to ask the audience first, before we get into some of our own hypotheses, what are some issues that your community cares a lot about, but you have a hard time getting traction on politically? And if you have any thoughts on why you think that gap exists, we'd love to hear it. So if you want to drop in the Q&A something written, or if you'd like to raise your hand to come off mute, Brianna will help us. And we'll spend a couple of minutes here.
And while folks are dropping their questions or thinking about that, we got a question from Larissa about whether Gallup has any data about wastewater. Gallup's, the chart that Sarah just showed is from Gallup's annual tracking poll, asking voters their top environmental concerns. And I'll drop the link into the chat in a moment. It doesn't ask about wastewater. There are some questions both in WaterHub polling around sanitation, and in the value of water poll that US Water Alliance runs annually that get more into wastewater. So we'll drop those links as well. But the challenge is that most of the big national pollsters, they don't even include water if they're asking voters about all the issues. And then Gallup just has the one water answer. So still some room to grow in terms of having pollsters prioritize water in their testing.
Yeah, I see a couple of responses that lobbying power, so often opposition or industrial interests have a lot more money and capacity to put into their lobbying efforts, are quite powerful. I'm also seeing things noted around financial power and voter interests aren't always lined up, and elected officials tend to engage where their money is. The fact that there's a lack of, or a gap in knowledge and understanding about the protections that are in place and how that impacts quality and service reliability, and kind of the narrative around regulations as a negative thing. Which I think is, we try to use words like safeguards and protection because people have that negative connotation around words like regulation, even though we know in many cases those are good things.
I see raised hand. I don't think I'm able to unmute them, but I just wanted to point that out.
Oh, where'd it go?
While we're waiting, I saw David asked about how are cutbacks in the proposed budget likely to affect EPA programs for water protection. The sort of like policy question is not our lane, but what I can say to David's point about, he says, it seems to me the dogmatic partisan fixation on budget cuts, regardless of their rationale, is the main reason why funding falls short now more than ever. I think that's absolutely right. This sort of, the opposition is really good at having super tight, frankly, oversimplified talking points that undermine support for things that we know are otherwise really popular. We'll get into that in more detail later around community safety and equity. But the good news is that there is polling that shows that people are concerned. So I'll drop this once I stop talking. There are some polls that show that the recent round of federal layoffs raised concerns among voters, and that voters in general, and there's of course a partisan divide here, are worried about some of the cuts that are being made in the federal government. They understand that there are potential implications for food safety, for public health and safety, et cetera. So you're right, the opposition's messaging is being used to justify their policy choices, but I think the public does, in some cases, have a more nuanced understanding of what the risk or trade-offs are, and that's an opening for us to speak to the concerns that voters have and emphasize the impact on their lives, really getting to, their family, their home, their health, their pocketbooks, et cetera.
Yeah, I think two other things I want to point out. This is like a really robust discussion. I mean, rampant disinformation. Also the it's a sort of a narrative thing, but the public perception of the persona of environmentalism, quote unquote, I think is something worth acknowledging. In many places. There's lots of people fighting for health and safety who might not think of themselves as environmentalists per se. And then also, in many ways, people learn about these issues through the media, and there is, Paul mentions the idea of looking at things at the tap versus the source of problems, and this kind of filter first approach. Needing to protect people, but also maybe not connecting the dots as much to help educate the public so that they're able to reach out to their legislators. Again, many reasons: the influence of special interests, knowledge gaps, and then a concerted political effort to devalue these interests, for sure. One thing we have been looking at is how the environment sits within kind of a broader ecosystem when it comes to public opinion and elections and interacting with elected officials. These are some results from a February 2025 Pew survey that we found quite interesting. And I'm going to zoom into the partisan chart on the right in just a moment. But one of our hypotheses is that even though there's strong majority support to protect clean water, clean up pollution, the environment in many ways is not the top of mind concern compared to other issues. So this question was asking voters what they think are very big national problems. And we see that issues that are really rising to the top and popping are those around affordability, the affordability of healthcare, inflation, as well as troubles in our democracy. So the role of money in politics and the federal budget and the ability for political parties to work together. This can be, I'm sure these things can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, so it's hard to read exactly what this means, but we see that environmental quote unquote issues that were asked here, like climate change and the impact of natural disasters, were much lower. I will note Nicole mentioned a lot of these national polls that are kind of cross issue don't even ask specifically about water. And I think that is something we hope to see more of, because I think it's a missed opportunity to better understand how these different issues play together. But just zooming into some of this partisan difference, this Pew survey shows that the difference between asking about or wording around the impact of natural disasters versus climate change as a big national problem, there's quite a large partisan split here. So 54% difference between Democratic and Republican leaning voters who see climate change as a big national problem, while a notable but much smaller divide, just 21% on the impact of disasters. That's something Nicole's going to get into a little bit more when we talk about the research we've been doing around climate communications and resilience. But we do see that these opinions shift over time, both to make our lives easier and to make them harder. But one thing I wanted to point out, last year, the University of Chicago, in partnership with the Associated Press and Center for Public Affairs Research, looked at how voter opinions on climate change and climate policies interacted with whether or not people had experienced extreme weather events firsthand in their life. So they found that perspectives on climate change are that firsthand experience is a major factor in those perceptions. More than half of the people who experienced climate events directly attributed that experience to influencing their views, and are more likely to consider climate an important issue in an election and to support actions like funding for community adaptation. One hypothesis we might have here is that the more people, as we know, more people are going to be experiencing these extremes, and that there's an opportunity to try to help mobilize people experiencing those impacts firsthand and turning that concern into support for policies. We might also expect to see a bigger gap between the opinions of those people who experience extreme weather firsthand and those who report that they do not. So that's just something to keep in mind. But there's also a lot of other water issues where we have noticed shifting public opinion in the last decade. This is a chart from our poll last year, that 2024 poll we keep mentioning, where we asked voters specifically about their top drinking water concerns. And one thing that really stood out to us was that PFAS, or forever chemicals, popped as the having the strongest amount of concern. So 68% of voters saying PFAS is something they're very concerned about, 66% for lead, 65% for outdated infrastructure, 60% for climate change. And this is, I'm going to get into actually some of the partisan splits here as well, but this is something that we really took notice of because we've been asking about PFAS issues over the last many years. And this is a relatively recent development that we've seen. For a long time, voters reported to us in our surveys they didn't even really know what PFAS were. And we have kind of hypothesized that for many voters 10 years ago, PFAS was an issue. If they were familiar with it, it was sort of more in the bucket of their brain around toxics in consumer products or firefighting. That's the way that it had been talked about in the media quite a bit, and not seen as a major water contamination issue. But today, we see that it's popping as one of the things people are most concerned about. There's a lot more awareness around PFAS in drinking water in particular, that issue. And we're seeing that the opposition isn't really even arguing against the merits that PFAS aren't safe and that they aren't in our drinking water. That fight has really moved into the zone of who's responsible for shouldering the burden to clean it up. Do we have the technology and the money to do that cleanup? And so this is an issue, I think, that shows how advocacy, education, public awareness, and the media have played a big role in shifting those opinions. In some ways, I see that similarity to the issue around lead as well. That took a bit of time to percolate in the public consciousness from, when lead was seen as an issue, a safety issue around childhood safety, paint in homes, and because of a huge public health crisis and then a concerted effort to educate the public, and through media and public outrage, lead is also now a major concern on this list as well. And those two issues, actually, we see outdated infrastructure, lead pipes, and PFAS as having the least difference in the political party ideology and how people respond to this question. So less than 20% difference, which is actually like pretty close in today's hyper political environment compared to climate change, where there's like a 40% spread between Democrats and Republicans being concerned about that impact. All right, I'm almost done with my section, and I'll hand it to Nicole, and we'll have a couple more questions. We also find that water infrastructure is pretty unifying and a place where voters show that they care. So this chart is from our 2024 poll as well. We've asked this question for a couple of years about water infrastructure as it relates to other types of infrastructure that the federal government should be investing in. And we have found year over year more voters, in this case it was 63%, say drinking water and sewer infrastructure should be a priority for federal spending. That's more than any other category, including roads and bridges. And there was not very much differentiation between Republican, Independent, and Democratic identifying voters in this question as well. I think we had 67% of Democrats select this compared to 60% of Republicans. Our friends at the U.S. Water Alliance and Value of Water campaign also do a much more in-depth survey of water infrastructure opinions and water utility opinions. So we can share their 2025 Value of Water Index that came out last month with everyone here. A couple of things to note: high support for or high identification, 92% of voters saying water access is an important issue. And that was even in the context of a kind of broader question around the economy and inflation. Those were the top three answers, with reliable water being one of those top answers. So that's why I'm actually interested in us not just testing about climate versus other issues at the national level, but asking about water. So hopefully we'll see some more of those. Val also found strong bipartisan support for funding for water, and a majority of voters saying that they view candidates more favorably if they support funding water infrastructure. The second thing I want to note is this year VOW's survey also asks about the intersection between water service and natural disasters. Their study found 20% of respondents saying they experienced water service impacts due to extreme weather in the last 5 years. About half reported water-related impacts generally from drought, wildfire, flooding, freezes, storms. And 70% believe it is very or extremely important for the federal government to reduce the likelihood of water challenges resulting from natural disasters. One thing I noticed, and it's a good segue to this next section with Nicole, is that they ask about weather and disasters. They didn't ask language about climate change. So I'm going to kick it over to Nicole to start wading into the sticky politics here.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, as Sarah said, and as that Value of Water Index indicates, climate change is this interesting conundrum for water communicators, because on one hand, all these superstorms and deep freezes and heat waves are making water challenges more visible, right? Where they once may have only been visible and impacting places that had the most extreme levels of disinvestment and deferred maintenance. Now all of our water systems are failing in the face of really extreme weather. And yet, while extreme weather and climate change are making our issues more visible and more widely felt, we know how polarizing climate change can be as a topic of conversation, while water tends to pull really nonpartisan and be quite a unifier. And so how do we connect the dots without triggering political opposition? One of the things that we've been seeing in our network and sort of in the broader environmental and even the climate field is a pivot from talking about climate change and climate adaptation to talking about resilience. And the word resilience standing alone, it's broadly understood, I think, at least by many environmental communicators, that we're talking about climate resilience, or that sort of resilience includes environmental preparedness. So we asked a bunch of questions in our latest poll about resilience. But I'd love to know what your organization is doing. To what extent do you talk about climate change and use that terms, and with whom? And when do you, for instance, talk about extreme weather or weird weather or stronger storms and avoid the C words? Would love for you to either raise your hand to be unmuted or to drop your thoughts into the Q&A.
And the chat may or may not be working. I just changed the setting. So if
Thank you,
you want
Brianna.
to try, they are more than welcome to.
Great. Christina Morissette says, we say changing climate instead of climate change and use more specific words like drought when possible. That's totally consistent. Love that, Christina. And that's consistent with our advice generally on all things, not just on climate change, but actually like talking about the effects that have been felt in your community recently, I think is the most direct way to speak to people's lived experiences rather than using these broad terms. I see Jake saying he's using resilience most of the time. I'll keep checking out the chat, but I'm going to dig into what we learned about resilience in our polling. First, in our October 2024 poll, before we got into specific questions around resilience, we just asked voters how they feel about a range of terms that we might use in the public safety or the environmental or conservation field. And as you can see here, while public opinion is pretty positive on all these terms, including resilience, this, almost 3/4 of voters have a positive view of the term resilience. It's even stronger on the positive side for more general terms like protection and preparedness. And our guess is that there are two reasons for this, although, as I said, we're doing some more follow-up research on resilience specifically. One, resilience has become a bit of a buzzword lately, like sustainability previously. And I think that when these terms get used so widely by so many different groups, people tend to get suspicious of them. The other thing we found out when we asked some follow-up questions in our poll, that 9% of voters don't even know what the term resilience means. So it is relatively newly sort of in the wide public discourse, and I think it's actually less well understood than things like preparedness or readiness. The last thing is that there is certainly some connection in people's minds between resilience and climate change, although our polling suggests that there's still fairly open field to talk about resilience among center and right of center audiences. And so that's the good news for those of you that are going in that direction. And yeah, Curtis noted that resilience seems like a backhanded compliment to communities most likely to face impacts. And absolutely, while we didn't get that data in our polling because there wasn't a ton of open-ended questions, there's certainly lots of anecdotal evidence and lots of interviews and news stories from communities that have been praised for their resilience in the wake of preventable disasters, that term has been used, wielded cynically and frankly used to shift the focus from government's responsibility to keep people safe to communities' need to continue recovering in the wake of things that we should have been able to prevent in the first place. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Curtis. Next slide, please. However, when we asked about disaster resilience specifically, as you can see, people really like the idea. And again, there is some partisan difference. So while, 90+% of Democrats said it's extremely or very important for communities to invest in disaster resilience, Republicans and independents were slightly less strongly in favor. A little less than 80% of independents agreed. We asked this question again using the word climate change, and the partisan split was even greater. So we'll say that if you're speaking to a broad audience, talking about disaster resilience versus climate resilience is likely to appeal more. And again, per that earlier slide about simple terms, unpacking what this looks like. So rather than using a shorthand like disaster resilience, if we were talking to residents, we might talk about homes and streets that are safe from flooding, right? Or a water system that doesn't break every time we have a super cold stretch. So the more specific you can be and local to what the impacts have been in your community, the more I think it's likely to resonate. Next slide. When we asked people an open-ended question about what term they might use other than resilience, as you can see, prepared and preparedness and strength really popped. I circled the words together and community here because I think this is sort of like a collectivist and an indicator of people's understanding that actually communities tend to come together in the wake of disaster, and that if we could have more togetherness and more watching out for and taking care of one another all the time, that would actually make us safer. And that is a thread that we want to continue to speak to, a value set that we want to continue to speak to. And yeah, I see Stephanie's talking about we use tolerance in addition to resilience. And I love that because again, that's getting at this. Well, one, tolerance, of course, can mean tolerance for cold or ability to tolerate cold, but it can also speak to some of this idea of like coming together, which is exactly where I'm going to transition next. Sarah, if you would advance the slide. So while climate change has been, stricken from the federal record by the current administration, and a lot of organizations are having to evolve their language too, particularly if they're reliant on federal grants, it's not the only set of terms that is currently under attack, right? A lot of words around equity and inclusion are also under attack. And so I just circled a number of words here at that intersection. So of course we can't talk about climate crisis now. We also can't talk about, we can't use the term historically or most risk or vulnerable populations or victims. And that is precisely because the Trump administration understands that when we start talking about people who are at highest risk because of historic disinvestment or discrimination or redlining, then it again helps people understand the role of government in creating vulnerability and leap to the place where we understand that government is responsible for redressing those harms and keeping people safe. So the administration is trying to make it impossible for us to share the history that has led to some communities being harmed more than other by preventable disasters. And what we need to do as climate and health and water communicators is continue to speak to that history, but in ways that don't trigger immediate opposition and immediate sort of partisan divides. Next slide. The good news is that while the Trump administration is waging this war on diversity, equity, and inclusion, the public still really cares about and supports those principles. This is from a number of different polls that we'll drop in the chat. But 8 in 10 adults across the US support the ideas that underlie DEI programs. 69% agree that the federal government should do more to protect the human and civil rights of communities of color. And this is that one's from October 2024. More recently in March, there were questions about whether we should continue or eliminate DEI programs. That is polarizing. And that's because, of course, the Trump administration and other opponents of this kind of programming have been trying to radicalize that idea and focusing on, this language as opposed to the values that underlie it, which are in fact broadly popular. Next slide. And to just take a different view on how we got to this place where there's a focus on DEI and this big backlash against DEI, I wanted to share this media research from the Collaborative on Media and Messaging. So this is looking at mentions of various terms connected to racial justice in television news specifically. And you can see in the wake of the George Floyd murder, structural racism was getting covered really broadly in the media. And that's because people, racial justice advocates specifically, were helping to educate both journalists and the public about the cultural drivers of that kind of racialized violence. And then the backlash started. So getting on towards 2021 and 2022, the opposition started trying to counter all of this talk about how we collectively have created the conditions where people of color are vulnerable to racialized violence by talking about critical race theory, this sort of like academic concept, and making it as though this is sort of like a radical left-wing elitist way of rewriting history and of vilifying American ideals. So that was sort of like wave one of opposition. And then the more recent wave of opposition that we're still in the midst of is this opposition to the idea of DEI. And the opposition chooses terms like critical race theory and DEI to focus on because, one, they're poorly understood, right? DEI is an acronym that doesn't even necessarily mean anything to the average person. Because if you ask people if they're in favor of diversity and equity and including everyone, they would say yes. But if you ask them if they're in favor of DEI programs, then all of a sudden the sort of like opposition messaging starts to have hit its target. And we shared this because we wanted to acknowledge that there's always going to be opposition to our work as people who are trying to champion health and safety for everyone. And the opposition's playbook is pretty predictable. They will always try to sideline our ideas, however popular they are, by making them seem elitist, exclusive, and like they are somehow excluding the broad majority of Americans. And we can counter that. Next slide. By focusing less on the how, the names of the programs and the sort of like academic research that underlies them, and much more, again, on these principles that most Americans support. So terms that we know really resonate widely across the political spectrum are fairness, dignity, family, ability to fulfill your potential. And so those are the words that we recommend leading with because they're the goals of these programs, right? They're the goals of environmental justice policies. Justice 40 is making sure that everyone is taken care of. Similarly, a lot of the opposition messaging tends to sort of like try to divide us and talk about them, whether we're talking about immigrants or people of color or low income people, they're often trying to dehumanize and distance their audience from these neighbors. And so we recommend using inclusive language, us and we. So when we're talking about what we want to accomplish, we want all of us to be able to trust the stuff that comes out of our taps, to be able to afford our water bills, to have homes that are safe from flooding and fires. So starting with us and we, I think, is really like a way to invite people in and help appeal to their basic humanity and decency. Similarly, as I already said, we want to start with the goal rather than the process. That said, there's still an opportunity and a need to share the history and to emphasize the role of government. Someone had commented earlier that, we're in this delicate moment right now where people don't understand the role of government in providing safe water, but they also increasingly mistrust government, especially the federal government. And so I think we as communicators need to talk about how the systems have gotten it wrong and historically have not been fair, but that the systems can be reformed when we all apply pressure and hold them accountable for their jobs and their responsibility to us as residents. And so I'll share some polling that we have and then some advice for how we do that. Next slide. So over the past couple of years, the Water Hub has tested a bunch of questions to try to get at like what sort of language or rationale will resonate with voters around the need to do targeted or prioritized funding and policies. And we asked voters, for instance, if we should prioritize communities at high risks of floods, fires, and other disasters, communities with high levels of air and water pollution, or using some of these shorthand terms like frontline, which is often what we use to refer to communities that are experiencing the first and worst of climate impacts, right? Well, if we unpack it and we describe what the risk is, many more people, 50% more voters, think it's a good idea to prioritize those communities. So our advice is skip shorthand like vulnerable, disadvantaged, or frontline, and instead describe what the need is, what the risk is, what the impact is. Next slide. And that's consistent with our general messaging dues. And I'm going to let Sarah dig a little bit more into those.
I'm gonna take us home, and I think this is actually a really good ending. There's a question from Gabrielle that we got about research on leading with fear versus hope or other emotions, which I think plays really well into some of these principles. And to be honest, our like recommendations for how to build connection and motivate people hasn't really changed that much in the wake of the election. We are really trying to advocate for an approach that kind of gets back to the basics of leading with our values. Before I get into that, there is actually quite a bit of research around kind of fear, hope, and other kind of motivators behind behavior. Fear is a really powerful messaging tactic. It's often used a lot in elections, the fear of our values being taken away or threatened to our values. And I think in many ways we want to position the problems as something that threatens our values, and the solution is something that helps us live our values. But I think the downside to that is there's a real burnout, fatigue, turnoff. If everything, I mean, these are urgent issues that we work on, but if everything is really urgent and everything is really scary, you are in the long run more likely to turn people toward apathy, because it's just too hard to stay engaged on urgent, scary things day after day. This may be something that you all feel in your work. And so offering inspiration, hope, and a vision for a future where we are living our values does offer a like longer term prospect in motivating people. And there is a lot of research behind that as well. So our recommendations are starting with the why. This is about our values, connecting around shared values. We want to live with dignity, as Nicole said, family, health, community. We want to use really simple and clear language and avoid jargon as much as possible. We want to be really descriptive when we're talking about both the problems that we face, as well as our vision for what the world looks like when we work together to solve them. So painting a picture with our words, using pictures as well, and describing the impacts, both the impact that people are facing because of the problem, as well as describing what the payoff will be when we fix them. People are less interested in the inner workings of legislation. They want to know what it means that their street doesn't flood, their kids can walk to school safely, they can get clean water out of their taps. So we've come to the end here. We've got 10 minutes, and I'm sure we can stick around a little longer than that to have discussion questions, but Brianna's going to drop in the chat a survey. As we mentioned, we are going to be partnering with Climate Advocacy Lab to do some more in-depth audience understanding research, as well as some additional polling this year. And so we'd love in that survey, in addition to getting just feedback so we can continue to improve our programming, we really want to ask you all, who are you trying to reach? What are the questions that you want us to ask? So we can develop our research this year to really be most helpful to our community.
I saw a question from Zoe that I'd love to speak to. Zoe said, respectfully, just in general, shouldn't our primary goal be to assume a proactive leadership position rather than reactive to the far right's attacks, i.e. use the most direct and truthful language as a general rule, as opposed to walking on eggshells around what Fox News has caused people to think? 100%, Zoe. As Sarah said, our recommendations on how to message climate change and equity actually haven't changed that much in the wake of the election. We've always advised starting with the goal and starting with really unpacking what we mean by water justice or water equity or climate resilience, rather than relying on that shorthand. So absolutely, we wouldn't recommend, if your audience is already on board with talking about equity and climate change, we're not counseling you to change it unless your organization needs to do so for reasons of financial or legal protection. But our general advice, and this is grounded in both quantitative research like polling and message testing and image testing and focus groups is that the more specific you can be about what we're trying to accomplish is speaking to, again, a community that's flood prone and saying, we should never have to worry about whether we can safely drive to school in the wake of a, an overnight rainstorm, or we shouldn't have to worry about whether our basement is safe from flooding. So again, being more specific is always our recommendation. And you can absolutely use the term equity rather than fairness if that resonates with your audience. We definitely defer to you to know what your community is and or the elected official that you're targeting. But in any case, we absolutely want to play the long game. And that's been an interesting question that's come up from a lot of our partners is how much should we adapt to, right, and speak to this political moment, knowing that we really need to change it. And our position as, as narrative advisors is that we want to play the long game. Absolutely. We need to continue to build public literacy around climate change and a public understanding of how we got to this place in which almost every water issue disproportionately impacts low-income people and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So we need to be doing that public education, but that isn't necessarily what we lead with. We lead with what do we want to accomplish? What does every one of us deserve for our homes and our families and our loved ones and our health? And then we get to how do we accomplish it?
While we're waiting to see if we have any other hands, I don't know if you wanted to answer Nancy's question about how we know who are voters in our polls.
Yeah, pollsters use the voter file. And they can't see how people's voting behavior. So they will in fact ask people how they identify in terms of political affiliation. And what issues they vote around, but they can see who are registered voters, and that is the list that they use to solicit poll respondents. And we haven't done any polling, Nancy, of non-voters. There have been lots of focus groups, including some pretty recent focus groups around clean water views that Water Foundation ran that were more broad. And I think I'd have to check the research that we're planning now through Grow Progress's audience understanding tool. I think we can choose if it's voters or not. So this may be the first research we do in which we would open that more broadly, because of course we know one of the problems is that there are a lot of communities that don't have faith that the voting process will lead to material changes in government, and therefore we need to figure out how to, like, what is it going to take to motivate those people. And of course it's not a messaging question. In many cases it's an organizing question, but the more sort of information that we can share with organizers and canvassers, the more we're happy to. And also we learn a ton from our partners who are doing field organizing.
Yeah, one other thing I'll note, you might see, this is a little bit on like there's some polling literacy, which I'm not the expert on, but the difference between registered and likely voters. I don't think you mentioned that, Nicole. So our polls, we poll registered voters, so that just means people who are registered to vote. We think that gives us kind of the broadest swath of opinion available. I think it's probably more important if you're like an elected official running like election type polling. We do more issue type polling, obviously, to look at, there's definitely different models that pollsters use to identify who they think is likely or not to actually turn out to the polls. And so there is some difference there, but some of it's based on modeling. There was also a question from Stephanie about language for educators, and I have to admit that's not something that the Water Hub, like speaking to children, is not like an area of expertise that we've really honed in on. But I was trying to look up. I went to this like wonderful climate storytelling event hosted by Yale and Princeton's climate communications organizations, and there was this amazing youth PBS personality who has an environmental show who had like amazing things to say. So I'm gonna look that up and try to drop that person in the chat, because I think their would probably have some resources or just looking at how they talk about issues. But there's kind of an old communications idiom, which is like, anything you say, you should be like a fifth grader should be able to understand you. And I kind of think that's true. It's a cliche for a reason. And that's why we say trying to speak as clearly and as simply and as a good way to connect with people. And so I think that's probably true with young people as well, who are, I mean, a lot of research shows young people today feel a great deal of anxiety about the world that they are being left with. And so I think that it's on us to own what's happening and also provide a pathway for action so that that anxiety doesn't turn into hopelessness.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that Peter from the Partnership Project shared that they did voter and non-voter surveys around environmental priorities. It looks like their latest was from 2022, but that they are updating it this summer. So we'll include that link in our follow-up materials, but you can see it now in the chat. Thank you, Peter.
And then I just put in the chat, if you want to look up Susie Hicks, the climate chick. This is the environmental educator that I mentioned. She was really cool.
Yeah, and I see, sorry, there was a question in the chat from, oh, I now have lost it, but someone asked, Jane asked if anyone here has found another word for resilience. I'm not sure if regular people know exactly what it means. So we mentioned that 9% of voters in our poll didn't know what it means. And we actually tested terms like climate safety, climate readiness, and climate preparedness against climate resilience, and climate preparedness and readiness pulled better. So I think, again, you might switch climate for disaster, depending on your audience, but I think those terms generally, if you need a shorthand, are more effective. But again, speaking specifically to the risks in your community and the impacts that have been felt there will likely be even more effective. And yeah, I love Paul just dropped out bouncing back when your community takes a hit. That bouncing back and recovering and coming together were among the terms that people use when we ask them for to define resilience, and we can share that link as well. In fact, we did, in addition to polling on resilience, we also did a media audit of how the press covers resilience and a sort of representative but relatively small look at how different nonprofits are using the term. So we'll share that report in our follow-up materials as well to give you a sense of just like what's the current usage and views on the term. And Brianna's way ahead of me. We are at the hour, so for those that need to drop, please do. If you have additional questions, I know that we talked a lot and we were somewhat slowed by our chat challenges in the beginning, so we're happy to stay on for another 5 to 10 minutes. If you have additional questions, you're welcome to hang out. As I said, we'll also send an email with the slides, the links that we mentioned, some additional messaging guidance, and the recording if you weren't able to watch or you want to share with colleagues.
Yeah, I can and thank you all so much. Please give us feedback. There was these two questions that just came in at the end around rate increases, and then there was one on kind of proactive action, which is probably in line with your research, Nicole. So I can take this. Do we have any research connecting how much folks pay for their water and their opinions on climate change or infrastructure preparedness? I am not actually sure if we have that kind of cross tab. It'd be interesting to see. The Value of Water Index has in the past actually looked at opinions around how much more people are willing to pay to address some of these things, and we have looked at like how in our surveys we've asked previously like how often people feel like they are struggling to keep up with their bills, and have found that it's around 30% of respondents say that they're feeling that unaffordability pinch when it comes to water. it's really hard to get data exactly on this, like what is affordable for, there's so many water utilities and not a good national source of that data. The EPA did recently do an affordability assessment and found that I think it was like 1 in 7 people are living in a household that's facing unaffordable water bills. But I'm not totally sure how it relates to opinions on other things. I'd be curious. Maybe that's something we can look at. It's probably we find affordability is something that does impact everyone, but is more concentrated with voters and in households with lower incomes. So you could probably use that as a proxy to kind of see if you could understand. But generally speaking, people are majority more willing to pay a little bit more to address some of these things. But as the price of everything goes up, that pinch gets felt a little bit more. So we've seen some successes in states or counties or water districts where they've had to raise rates, but have coupled that with like a bond measure, if they were like trying to get voters to support a bond measure or something, coupling that with affordability programs, so people could see like where they were trying to kind of distribute the cost of that more equitably within the community, that there was some support for that. But I have to do some more digging on that question. But yeah, there's like affordability is a huge issue. Nicole, I don't know if you saw this, how do you message to people taking proactive action, not just responding to disaster?
We have a whole message guide on disaster preparedness that we'll include in our follow-up materials, but absolutely. We, given what the polling shows about the number of people that have experienced disasters or extreme weather and the number that are concerned about it happening in their community, I think, it's safe to assume that most audience are either worried about it or have some personal experience with extreme weather. And so I think those audiences are really ripe to talk about, we need to get ahead of this in the future. We need to make sure that both our homes and neighborhoods and our water systems are prepared for stronger storms, for increased heat, for deeper freezes, et cetera. And as I said, we'll drop a message a message guide in our follow-up materials around that.
And I want to address a question from David, which we're not political strategists, so I'm gonna just tell you my opinion, and which is do we have confidence that voters calling their representatives can override the Republican proposal to make deep EPA cuts? No, I don't. I think that for me, there's just the safety in which most of the federal elected officials feel in their districts. There's just like this hyper loyalty, partisan loyalty going on right now. So I don't see that issue. Maybe there's like a few instances of some particularly vulnerable people, but there's just this, I just don't see that as like the goal for me, and especially as a communications and narrative strategist. I see these as opportunities to build power, because we want them to become issues in the next election. We want people to be mobilized around this kind of overreach and disregard. And so I see it more as an opportunity to keep people engaged, so they don't just say, that's just gonna happen, I sort of said it's just gonna happen no matter what, but like that's not a very helpful frame for people to be in. So it's an opportunity to say, like, we're gonna fight against this for these values, for these reasons, for these outcomes, and then hopefully using that to continue to build power, so that when there is an opportunity to switch, anyway, that's my take on it. But I don't have a lot of confidence that
Well, I wanted to offer a couple of anecdotes. The Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works met, I think, last week. And the conversation there was pretty reassuring. The current chair is Senator Capito, and she was talking about like the need to continue investing in water, the need to invest in water in rural communities in particular. So I think within these committees that are actually paying attention and that have some leadership ability and some ability to like put this on the agenda, there is bipartisan awareness that the federal government's role in funding water is really important to their communities. And I also wanted to mention, I'm not sure if there was a recording, but if there was, we'll share it later. May Stevens is one of the lobbyists that has been working on environmental water issues specifically in DC on behalf of many nonprofits and utilities for a decade plus. And she just led a webinar 2 days ago about how to reach Congress on issues of water and what's movable right now. So if we can get a recording, we'll include it in our follow-up materials. And if not, we can at least hopefully get some top lines that we can share. If you could, I'll drop her name and LinkedIn profile in the chat, and I would recommend following her on LinkedIn if you're on there, because she shares lots of resources and tips.
Well, we got to mostly everything. So thank you all. The most awkward ending to this webinar of all time, but our emails, Nicole and I's emails were up. They're just our first name at waterhub.org. We will follow up materials. I guess I'm just taking over the ending. We didn't really plan this part out, but yeah, thank you for staying with us. We'll follow up with the recording and materials, and we hope to consider this continue this conversation. Please don't hesitate to get in touch so we can make sure the resources that we're sharing are most helpful for you.
Yeah, and a pitch to also sign up for our newsletter if you don't already get it, because that's where we'll share the forthcoming research that digs deeper into voter views or public views on resilience, as well as all of the messaging guides that are forthcoming for the year. Thank you all.